The snow fell in heavy, unrelenting sheets, blanketing the Wyoming plains like a shroud drawn tight over the world. Eleanor trudged forward, her boots sinking into the drifts that pulled at her like greedy hands from below. The cold was a living thing gnawing at her bones, seeping through the thin wool of her coat and the rags wrapped around her hands. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each one a small cloud that vanished into the white void. Little Thomas clutched her skirt with one fist, his small face pinched and red, while baby Clara whimpered faintly against her chest, bundled in the last scraps of blanket they had. The wagon trail had disappeared hours ago, swallowed by the storm, and the horizon was nothing but an endless blur of gray and white. No shelter, no fire, no mercy from the wind that howled like a distant wolf pack, indifferent to the woman and her children, staggering toward nothing. Her legs buckled first, a slow betrayal that started in her knees and spread upward. She dropped to one knee, then the other, the snow cushioning her fall with cruel softness. Thomas tugged at her arm, his mittened hands too small to pull her up. "Mama," he whispered, but the word was lost in the gale. Clara's cries grew weaker, a thin thread of sound against the roar. Eleanor's vision blurred, the edges darkening as hunger and exhaustion clawed deeper. She had walked for days since the fever took her husband back in the mining camp, leaving her with nothing but these two souls and a satchel of empty promises. The land didn't care. It stretched on vast and unbroken, burying the weak without a trace. Thomas stood there, his 5-year-old frame rigid against the wind. He didn't cry, not anymore. Instead, he positioned himself between his sister and the storm, his arms outstretched, as if to shield her from the flakes that dusted her tiny face. Eleanor watched him through half-closed eyes, a pang sharper than the cold slicing through her chest. He was so small, his coat patched and too big, inherited from a father he barely remembered. Yet there he was, guarding Clara with a fierceness that belonged to men twice his age. The snow piled on his shoulders, but he didn't brush it away. He just stood silent sentinel in the white waste. Miles away on the edge of his ranch, Harlan rode his horse through the drifts, the animal's flanks steaming in the bitter air. The storm had come sudden, as they often did in these parts, turning the open range into a frozen hell. He pulled his hat low, the brim crusted with ice, and scanned the horizon for any strays from his herd. The cattle were hunkered down, somewhere he hoped, but a man couldn't leave it to chance. Not in 1895, when a single blizzard could wipe out everything he'd scraped together after years of riding herd and breaking sod. His hands ached on the reins, calloused from wire and wood, but the pain was familiar, a dull companion to the emptiness that had settled in him since the war. The plains were his now, harsh and beautiful, their silence a mirror to the quiet grief he carried for a family long-gone brother, lost to the bottle parents, to the soil. Something caught his eye, then a dark smudge against the endless white. He urged his horse forward, the beast snorting protests into the wind. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into figures. A woman collapsed in the snow, a child standing guard over an infant. Harlan's breath hitched, the scene etching itself into him like a brand. The boy couldn't be more than 5 or 6, held his ground, arms wide, face set in grim determination. Snowflakes clung to his lashes, but his eyes were fierce, protecting the bundle that must be his kin. The woman lay still, her form half buried, as if the land had already claimed her. Harlan dismounted his boots, crunching the crust, and approached slow, not wanting to startle the boy. But the child didn't flinch. He just stared up, silent challenge in his gaze. Harlan knelt, brushing snow from the woman's face. She was young, maybe 25, her skin pale as the drift's lips tinged blue. A faint pulse fluttered at her neck, weak, but there. The baby stirred against her, a soft mule escaping. He scooped them up, first the woman and infant together, draping them over his saddle, then lifting the boy, who finally let his arms drop, exhaustion claiming him. The ride back to the ranch house was a blur of wind and white. Harlan's mind fixed on that moment, the boy's vigil in the snow, a tiny act of defiance against the indifferent world. It stirred something deep in him, a crack in the hard shell he'd built, reminding him of his own boyhood watches over a sickly sibling long ago buried. The cabin loomed out of the storm smoke curling from the chimney like a promise. Harlan kicked open the door, the warmth rushing out to meet the cold. He laid the woman on his bed, the boy beside her, and stoked the fire-high flames, leaping to chase the chill. Clara quieted as he warmed milk from the cow, dribbling it into her mouth with a rag. Thomas watched him warily huddled under a blanket, but took the offered bread without a word. Eleanor stirred hours later, her eyes opening to the flicker of lantern light and the stranger's shadowed face. Pain throbbed in her limbs, but the heat was a balm wrapping around her like forgotten mercy. In the days that followed, the storm raged on, trapping them in the small space. Harlan tended the animals in brief forays, returning with arms full of wood, his coat shedding snow like regret. Eleanor recovered slow, her body mending while her mind replayed the horrors, the husband's cough turning bloody, the camp's indifference as they turned her out, the endless walk with children in tow. Memories surfaced in quiet moments, her girl's dreams of a homestead shattered by a man who promised gold but delivered dust. Thomas played near the hearth, stacking stones into makeshift forts, his guard duty in the snow, a silent bond that drew Harlan's gaze often. The rancher spoke little at first, his words measured like the rations he shared. But in the evenings, as wind battered the walls, he mended a torn dress for Clara, his large hands surprisingly gentle, revealing a softness honed by loss. Eleanor watched him, curiosity piercing her weariness. "You've no family here?" she asked one night, voice soft over the crackle of fire. Harlan paused, needle in hand. "Had a brother, once. Lost him to the rails. This land's all that's left." His eyes met hers, a flicker of shared solitude passing between them. "Every legend has a story. Find them on Wild West Chronicles." The days lengthened into a fragile routine while the storm held the world hostage. Eleanor rose before dawn each morning, testing the strength returning to her limbs. She moved quietly around the cabin, folding blankets with hands still trembling, washing the few tin plates in the basin Harlan kept by the stove. The work was small, deliberate tasks that anchored her to the present and kept memory at bay. Thomas followed her like a shadow, carrying kindling in his arms, or sweeping the floor with a broom too tall for him. He spoke seldom, but his eyes tracked every movement Harlan made, measuring the man who had pulled them from the snow. Harlan watched them both without seeming to watch. He split wood outside until his shirt clung damp to his back, despite the cold, then carried armloads inside and stacked them neat beside the hearth. When Eleanor tried to help, he shook his head, once gentle but firm. "Rest while you can," he said. "Land don't forgive weakness twice." Yet he left extra milk warming near the fire for Clara, and once when the baby fussed, he lifted her without asking, cradling the small weight against his shoulder, until her cries eased into hiccuping sighs. Eleanor caught the gesture and felt something loosen inside her chest, a knot she had carried so long she no longer noticed its weight. One evening the wind dropped enough for them to step onto the porch. Snow lay thick and silent across the yard, the barn a dark shape against the fading light. Harlan showed Thomas how to check the latch on the henhouse door so the foxes couldn't slip through. The boy listened, gravely repeating the motion with small, careful hands. When they returned inside, cheeks stung red, Harlan poured coffee into 3 cups, 2 full, 1 half, and set them on the table. Eleanor took hers without speaking, the heat seeping into her palms like a secret shared. "You're from the Black Hills country?" Harlan asked after a long silence. "Deadwood at first, then a claim farther north." She stared into the dark liquid. "Fever took him quick. The others said we couldn't stay. Too many mouths, not enough pay dirt." Her voice stayed even, but her fingers tightened on the cup. "I thought the walking would end somewhere." Harlan nodded once. He did not offer pity. He knew its uselessness. Instead, he told her about the ranch, how he'd filed on the land 8 years earlier after mustering out of the cavalry with nothing but a discharge paper and a horse that limped. How he'd built the cabin log by log through winters that tried to kill him. How sometimes on clear nights he still heard his brother's laugh carried on the wind, though the man had been dead 12 years. Dreamed of a bigger spread once, he said quietly. Wife, children, running the yard. Never came. He looked at Thomas, who was tracing patterns in spilled coffee with one finger. Guess dreams change shape when you're not looking. Eleanor met his gaze. For the first time, since the fever, she felt seen not as a widow, not as a burden, but as a woman who had walked through hell and still stood. Something warm and unfamiliar stirred beneath her ribs. The storm broke on the 9th day. Sunlight sliced through thinning clouds, turning the snow to blinding silver. Harlan saddled his horse to check fences. Eleanor bundled Clara and followed Thomas outside, letting the children feel the light on their faces. The boy ran clumsy circles in the yard, laughing for the first time since autumn. Eleanor watched him, then looked toward the barn where Harlan worked. He paused, axe resting on his shoulder, and their eyes met across the distance. Neither smiled, but the moment held steady as a heartbeat. That night, the cabin felt smaller, warmer. Harlan mended a tear in Eleanor's coat while she rocked Clara by the fire. Thomas slept on the pallet near the hearth, one hand curled near the baby's blanket. When the last stitch was set, Harlan handed the coat back. Their fingers brushed brief, accidental, and neither pulled away at once. You don't have to leave when the trail's clear, he said, voice low. Plenty of work here. Room for 3 more. Eleanor studied the fire. We're strangers still. We were, he answered. Ain't anymore. She looked at him, then really looked, the lines carved deep around his eyes, the quiet strength in the set of his shoulders, the way he had knelt in the snow without hesitation to lift her children. Trust came slow to her, like water finding its way through cracked earth, but it came. I'll stay a while, she said at last. See what the land allows? Harlan nodded, the faintest curve touching his mouth. Outside, the moon rose cold and clear, painting the snow with silver light. Inside, 3 small lives breathed in the same warm room. And for the first time in years, the silence felt like peace instead of absence. Spring arrived slow and grudging, as it always did on the high plains. First, the snow retreated to shadowed hollows, then the grass pushed through in pale, tentative spears. The creek behind the cabin swelled with meltwater running loud and cold over stones worn smooth by decades of thaw. Eleanor learned the rhythm of the place, the way one learns a new language through repetition, small mistakes, quiet triumphs. She rose with the first light, now pulling on Harlan's old sheepskin coat that still carried the faint scent of wood smoke and horse. She fed the chickens gathered eggs still warm from the nest, milked the 2 cows whose udders hung heavy after winter. Her hands cracked and bled at first, the skin splitting across knuckles, but she wrapped them in strips of clean cloth and kept working. Pain was an old acquaintance. She no longer flinched from it. Thomas helped without being asked, carrying the milk pail in both hands, spilling only a little. Clara rode on Eleanor's hip, babbling at the hens as if they might answer. Harlan watched her adaptation, the way a man watches a young tree take root after a hard transplant. He said nothing when she burned the first batch of cornbread, only scraped the charred bits into the slop bucket for the pigs, and started a fresh batch himself, showing her how to bank the coals so the oven held steady heat. When she wrestled the heavy washtub outside to scrub sheets in the creek, he appeared without comment, took one end of the wringer, and turned it with her until the water ran clear again. Their shoulders brushed once. She felt the solid warmth of him and did not step away. Evenings brought stories. Harlan spoke of his years trailing cattle up from Texas, the dust that never left a man's lungs, the stampedes that sounded like thunder rolling backward. He told her about the brother who laughed too loud and drank too deep, how they'd sworn to build something lasting together, how one winter the bottle won. Eleanor listened, rocking Clara, and offered pieces of her own past, in return the sod house in Nebraska, where she was born, the way her mother sang hymns while she churned butter, the letter her husband sent promising riches that never materialized. The words came easier now, less like pulling teeth. One afternoon, Harlan took Thomas to check the new calves. Eleanor followed at a distance, carrying Clara in a sling against her chest. The boy walked beside the rancher, matching his stride as best he could, asking questions in his serious way. Why do some cows have horns and some don't? How long until the grass is tall enough to hide in? Harlan answered each one, plain and patient, crouching once to show the boy how to check a calf's navel for infection. When Thomas reached out and touched the soft, wet nose, the calf butted him gently, and the child laughed, a bright, startled sound that carried across the pasture. Eleanor stood at the fence rail watching them. Sunlight caught in Harlan's hair, turning the gray at his temples to silver. Thomas looked up at him with unguarded trust, the same look he once gave his father before fever stole it away. Something tight and fearful inside Eleanor loosened another notch. She had come here broken, expecting nothing. Now the days felt full of small, steady gifts. That night, after the children slept, Harlan sat across from her at the table, cleaning his rifle by lamplight. The soft metallic clicks filled the quiet. Eleanor mended one of Thomas's shirts, needle flashing in the glow. "You ever think of leaving?" she asked suddenly. He paused, oilcloth in hand. "Thought about it plenty. California. Oregon. Somewhere the winters don't try to kill you." He resumed, working slower now. "Always stayed. This ground's got my sweat in it. My mistakes. Figured I'd see it through." She nodded. "I used to dream of going back east. A little house with curtains. A school for Thomas. A piano, maybe." She smiled faintly at the absurdity. "Now I can't picture leaving this place either." Harlan looked up. Their eyes held across the scarred oak table. The air between them felt charged, like the moment before lightning. "I ain't asking for promises," he said quietly. "But if you want to stay, if you and the children want to make a life here, I'd be honored." Eleanor set the needle down. Her heart beat steady, not frantic. "We already are," she answered. He reached across the table. His hand covered hers, rough palm against her own cracked skin. Neither moved for a long minute. Outside, an owl called, once low and mournful, then fell silent. Inside, the lamp burned steady, and two people who had walked through years of solitude sat together in the same small circle of light. Summer deepened, turning the grass gold under a sky so wide it pressed the soul small. The days stretched long, filled with the steady labor that bound them closer than words ever could. Eleanor learned to throw a rope, her first attempts awkward, the laureate slapping useless against her thigh, until Harlan stepped behind her arms, encircling without touching, guiding her wrist through the slow arc. When the loop finally settled over a fence post, clean and sure, he gave a single nod, the corner of his mouth lifting just enough to count as praise. She felt the warmth of that small victory settle deep like rain soaking parched ground. Thomas grew taller in the space of weeks, or perhaps it only seemed so because he carried himself straighter now. He rode double with Harlan on the big bay gelding to check the upper pastures, small hands gripping the saddlehorn, face serious with concentration. Harlan taught him to read sign-fresh tracks of coyote, the scrape of antelope hooves, the way wind bent the grass differently where water lay hidden beneath. The boy absorbed it all, storing knowledge the way dry earth stores water against drought. At supper, he repeated what he'd learned, voice careful and proud, and Harlan listened without interrupting, letting the child's words fill the room like smoke from a good fire. Clara took her first unsteady steps across the cabin floor one evening, in July, tottering toward Harlan, where he sat oiling harness. She reached him, tiny fingers clutching his knee, and he lifted her without thought, settling her on his lap while he continued working. The baby patted his weathered cheek, babbling soft nonsense, and Harlan's eyes softened in a way Eleanor had never seen. He murmured something low, too quiet for her to catch, but the tone was tender, private. Eleanor turned away to hide the sudden sting behind her eyes. She had not expected this, a man who could hold gentleness and strength in the same rough hands. Yet shadows lingered. Letters arrived with the infrequent supply wagon from Cheyenne, one from Eleanor's sister in Omaha, urging her to come east with the children, promising a room, a school, civilized life. Another, forwarded from Deadwood, carried the scrolled signature of her late husband's partner, claiming the claim had finally paid out enough silver to buy passage anywhere enough to start over clean. The money waited in a bank draft, he wrote, if she would only come sign for it. Eleanor read both by lamplight after the others slept, the paper crackling in her fingers. She thought of curtains, of a piano, of Thomas sitting at a desk instead of riding fence. She thought of safety. Then she looked across the room at the two small forms breathing even under the quilt, at the man who slept on the cot by the door, so she and the children could have the bed, and the ache in her chest told her the answer before her mind finished forming it. She burned the letters the next morning before dawn, watching the flames eat the promises of elsewhere. Harlan found the ashes, later gray and delicate, on the hearth. He said nothing, only swept them up careful and scattered them on the wind. Trouble came in August, not from the past, but from the living. A neighbor rancher, Amos Creed, rode up one afternoon with 3 hands at his back. Creed was a big man, red-faced and loud, who had filed on land adjoining Harlan's the year before, and never stopped eyeing the creek that ran through both spreads. Water rights were blood here, and Creed wanted more than his share. He sat his horse in the yard hat pushed back and declared the spring that fed the creek had shifted underground on Harlan's side, meaning the flow was his by rights now. He brought a surveyor's map, fresh ink, still smelling, and demanded Harlan sign it over or face the county judge. Harlan stood quiet in the doorway, arms folded. "Spring's been in the same place 30 years, he said. "Map don't change facts." Creed laughed, short and mean. "Facts change when a judge says so, and I've got witnesses who'll swear the water crossed the line last thaw." His eyes slid past Harlan to Eleanor, standing on the porch with Clara on her hip, Thomas half hidden behind her skirt. Pretty widow and her brood. Shame if they got caught in the middle of a range dispute. The threat hung plain. Eleanor felt ice slide down her spine despite the heat. Harlan's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "You leave my people be, Creed. This ends here or it ends hard." Creed smirked, wheeled his horse, and rode out with his men. Dust hung in the air long after they disappeared. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She sat by the window watching stars prick the black above the ridge. Harlan joined her without speaking, pulling a chair close. They sat in silence until she finally asked, "Will he come back likely?" "What then?" Harlan looked at her moonlight, catching the lines of his face. "We hold what's ours." Together, she reached for his hand. Their fingers laced callous against callous, steady as the land itself. Outside, the creek ran soft over stones, singing its old unhurried song. The tension coiled through the following weeks, like wire stretched too tight. Creed's men appeared at the edges of Harlan's range, never crossing the line outright, but close enough to be seen riding slow along the creek, pausing to study the water's flow, marking trees with red chalk that would wash away in the next rain, but served its purpose. They were reminders, warnings. Eleanor felt their eyes from the porch while she hung laundry, the white sheets snapping in the dry wind like flags of surrender she refused to raise. Harlan rode out each dawn to check the boundaries, rifle across his saddle face, set in the same quiet resolve he wore when he mended fences or birthed a calf in the dark. He came back dust-covered and silent, offering no details unless she asked. She asked once. He answered only, "They're testing," and left it there. She did not press. Instead, she began carrying the old shotgun when she walked to the henhouse or fetched water, its weight familiar, now less frightening than the alternative. Thomas sensed the shift without words. He stopped running wild in the yard and stayed closer to the cabin, helping Eleanor more than playing. One afternoon, he found her splitting kindling behind the house, small, precise swings with the hatchet Harlan had taught her to use. The boy watched a moment, then picked up the smaller axe and began stacking the split pieces without being told. His shoulders were narrow but square, carrying worry too heavy for his years. Eleanor paused, blade mid-swing, and looked at him. He met her gaze, serious. "Will they take our water, Mama?" She lowered the hatchet. "Not if we hold tight." He nodded once, the same single nod Harlan gave when something was settled. Then he went back to stacking wood, small hands steady. That night, Harlan cleaned the rifles at the table while Eleanor darned socks by lamplight. Claire slept in her cradle. Thomas lay awake on his pallid eyes open to the ceiling beams. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. "We can't wait for them to make the first real move," Harlan said at last, voice low. "Judge'll side with whoever files first and pays loudest. Creed's already talking to the county seat." Eleanor set her needle down. "What's the plan tomorrow? I ride to town." "File our own claim on the spring, backed by 30 years of use. Bring back witnesses, old hands who remember when my father ran cattle here before the war. If Creed wants paper, we'll give him paper. And if he sends men while you're gone," Harlan looked at her across the scarred table, "you bar the door. Keep the shotgun loaded. Thomas knows where the shells are. You've got grit enough for both of us." She studied him, the faint scar along his jaw from a barbed wire tear years ago, the steady gray of his eyes. "I don't want to be the one left waiting again." He reached across, covered her hand with his. "You won't be. We go together. All four of us. Creed'll see we're not running." The decision settled between them, solid as stone. Dawn came cool and clear. They loaded the wagon with what they needed: blankets for Claire, bread and jerky, the claim papers Harlan had scratched out by lantern light. Thomas sat between them on the high seat, small body pressed close. Clara rode in Eleanor's lap, sucking on a crust. Harlan drove with one hand on the reins, the other resting easy near the rifle propped against his thigh. The road to Cheyenne was rutted dust rising in their wake like smoke from a dying fire. They passed other homesteads, sod roofs, sagging children waving from yards, and each time Harlan lifted his hat in greeting a quiet claim of belonging. Eleanor felt the miles fall away beneath the wheels, felt the land open around them, vast and unforgiving, yet theirs now in a way it had not been before. They reached town by noon. The courthouse stood square and plain, its wooden steps worn smooth by boots and hope. Harlan tied the team, helped Eleanor down, then lifted Thomas to the ground. Inside, the clerk looked up from his ledger, surprised to see a family instead of a lone rancher. Harlan laid the papers down. "Filing for prior use on the Spring Section 24, Township 5. Been there since before the territory was open." The clerk adjusted his spectacles. Red nodded slow. "You got witnesses bringing 3 in tomorrow. Old timers. They'll swear. Creed filed yesterday." Said the water shifted. Harlan's voice stayed even. "Water don't shift. Men do." The clerk hesitated, then stamped the claim. "Filed. Get your men here, quick." Outside again, Harlan breathed once deep. Eleanor touched his arm. "We did it." "Not yet," he said. But his hand found hers squeezed once. They camped that night on the edge of town, under stars sharp as knife points. Harlan built a small fire. Eleanor fed Clara while Thomas roasted a potato in the coals. No one spoke of tomorrow. They didn't need to. The fire snapped, the night held them close, and in the quiet Eleanor felt something new take root, not just survival, but choice. Voluntary. Whole. The courtroom smelled of old wood polish and tobacco, spit the air thick, despite the open windows that let in flies and the distant bawl of cattle being driven through town. Harlan stood at the rail in his best shirt, cleaned and pressed by Eleanor the night before, while she sat on the bench behind him with Clara asleep against her shoulder, and Thomas pressed to her side, small hand clutching the fabric of her skirt. Creed occupied the opposite side with his lawyer, a thin man in a store-bought suit who kept adjusting his collar as if the room itself choked him. The judge, a grizzled man named Whitaker, who had ridden circuit longer than most folks had lived in the territory, listened without expression as Creed's witnesses took the stand one by one. They spoke of the spring, moving after last winter's heavy snows of water, now flowing mostly on Creed's claimed side, of how Harlan's cattle drank more than their share. The words were smooth, practiced, paid for. Harlan's 3 old hands, men who had driven beeves with his father before the war, countered plain and stubborn. The spring had never shifted, the creek had always run true. 30-odd years of memory said so. Their voices cracked with age, but carried the weight of truth no paper could manufacture. Whitaker rubbed his jaw, eyes moving between the two parties. "This comes down to prior use and honest testimony," he said at last. "I've known Harlan McCready since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. Known his daddy before him. Land don't lie, but men do." He tapped the gavel once light. "Claim on the spring stays with McCready. Creed, you file on your side fair and square or not at all. Case closed." Creed surged to his feet, face darkening to the color of old brick. "That's robbery, Judge. You're favoring blood over law." Whitaker leaned forward. "I'm favoring 30 years over yesterday's ink. Sit down or I'll find you in contempt." Creed's lawyer tugged at his sleeve. Creed shook him off, but subsided, glaring across the room. His eyes locked on Eleanor for a long beat, long enough to make her skin crawl, then slid to Harlan. The promise in that look needed no words. Outside, the sun stood high, bleaching the boardwalk to bone white. Harlan helped Eleanor down the steps, one hand steady at her elbow. Thomas walked between them, chin up, mimicking the way Harlan carried himself. Claire woke and fussed until Harlan took her, settling her against his chest with the same easy competence he used on a skittish colt. They stopped at the general store for supplies. Harlan had promised a sack of flour coffee beans, a small jar of peppermint sticks for Thomas. While the clerk tallied the bill, Harlan added a length of blue calico without comment. Eleanor touched the fabric soft under her fingertips and felt her throat close. No one had bought her cloth since before the fever. On the ride home, the wagon creaked under fresh weight provisions, a new plow blade Harlan had bartered for the quiet victory they carried between them. Thomas sat on the tailgate legs dangling, sucking one of the peppermint sticks, slow to make it last. Clara dozed in Eleanor's lap. Harlan drove with both hands loose on the reins, shoulders eased for the first time in weeks. "You think you'll try again?" Eleanor asked when the town lay far behind. Harlan considered the horizon. "Maybe. Men like Creed don't quit easy. But next time he'll have to come at us straight. And we'll be ready." She nodded. The fear that had ridden with her since August felt smaller now, not gone, but diminished, like a shadow shortened by noon sun. They reached the ranch as dusk painted the ridges rose and gold. Harlan unhitched the team while Eleanor carried the parcels inside. Thomas ran ahead to check the henhouse, calling back that the eggs were still warm. When Harlan stepped through the door, dust clinging to his hat brim, Eleanor met him in the center of the room. She held out the folded calico. "You didn't have to." "Wanted to." He took her hand instead of the cloth, drew her closer until their foreheads touched. "Wanted you to have something pretty. Something that's just yours." Her breath caught. She lifted her face. He kissed her, then slow, deliberate tasting of dust and coffee and the long years they had both walked alone. It was not passion's wildfire, but something deeper, two people choosing each other in the plain light of day, no storm or fever or threat, forcing the hand. Thomas appeared in the doorway, saw them and ducked back out with a small, knowing grin. Clara cooed from her cradle. The cabin held them all, the four of them, now bound not by accident or pity, but by days stacked one upon the next, steady as stones in a good foundation. Outside, the creek ran clear over its ancient bed, singing the same song it had sung for decades. The land stretched on vast and harsh and beautiful indifference, still but no longer empty. Months later, when the first hard frosts silvered the grass, Eleanor stood on the porch, watching Harlan teach Thomas to sharpen an axe, their breaths clouding white in the cold morning air. Clara toddled toward them, arms outstretched, laughing, when Harlan scooped her up and set her on his shoulders. Eleanor rested one hand on the gentle swell beneath her apron, new life, stirring a promise made in quiet nights and shared silences. She slipped the plain gold band Harlan had given her back in September onto her finger, feeling its familiar weight. No ceremony, no crowd, just the two of them by the hearth vows spoken low while the children slept. "Enough." The wind rose, carrying the scent of pine and coming snow. Eleanor stepped down into the yard, joining her family where they worked and laughed together. The plains rolled away forever, but here in this small cleared space something lasting had taken root. Stay tuned for more Wild West mysteries on Wild West Chronicles.